In the summer of 1953, in two ordinary American cities, a fine grey powder began drifting down through the air. It settled on rooftops and gardens, on the windowsills of apartment buildings, on the swing sets in public parks, on the laundry that families had hung out to dry. It coated the streets where children walked to school. And the people who breathed it in, who brushed it from their sleeves, who watched it shimmer in the streetlights at night, were told nothing. They did not know that the haze was deliberate. They did not know that men in government offices had chosen their neighborhoods, marked them on maps, and arranged for this substance to be released above their homes. They did not know that one of the materials being sprayed contained cadmium, a heavy metal that the science of the time already understood to be toxic. They were not asked. They were not warned. They were simply, quietly, used. This is the story of how the United States Army turned two of its own cities into open-air laboratories. It is the story of a program that operated in the shadows for years, that spread chemical particles over the heads of unsuspecting families, and that was buried so thoroughly in secrecy that the people affected would not learn the truth for decades. And it is the story of a question that has never been fully answered, a question about what was really in those clouds, about who decided that ordinary citizens could be experimented upon without their knowledge, and about the long quiet cost that may have been paid by the poorest residents of two American cities. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to a moment when fear had reshaped the entire logic of the nation, when the line between protecting the public and endangering it had begun to blur in the minds of the men who held power. The early 1950s were years lived under a long shadow. The Second World War had ended less than a decade earlier, but the peace that followed had curdled quickly into a new and colder kind of conflict. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, ending the brief period in which the United States had stood alone as the world's only nuclear power. Almost overnight, the comfortable assumption of American invulnerability had collapsed. Now there were two superpowers, each armed with weapons capable of erasing cities, each convinced that the other was preparing for a final confrontation. The fear was not abstract. It seeped into everything. School children practiced hiding beneath their desks. Families discussed building shelters in their backyards. In this atmosphere of dread, the military planners of the United States found themselves confronting an uncomfortable set of questions. If an enemy wished to attack American cities, they would not necessarily do so with bombs alone. There were other weapons, quieter and in some ways more frightening. Biological agents could be released into the air, invisible clouds of bacteria designed to sicken and kill. And the most troubling possibility was that such an attack might come not from a fleet of aircraft, but from a small number of people moving quietly through a city, releasing their payloads from the back of a truck or from a rooftop. How would such an attack spread? How far would the particles travel? Where would they settle, and how many people would they reach before anyone realized what was happening? These were not questions that could be answered with theory alone. The planners believed they needed data, real data, gathered from real cities under real conditions. They wanted to know how a cloud of fine particles would behave when released into the complicated geography of an American urban center, with its tall buildings and narrow streets, its rising heat and shifting winds, its rivers and hills and open squares. They wanted to understand the patterns of dispersion, the way a substance released at one point might drift for miles, settling unevenly across neighborhoods, concentrating in some places and thinning in others. And to gather that data, they decided that they would conduct tests. They would release a substance into the air over actual cities, track its movement, and measure where it landed. The substance they chose had to be something that could be detected and measured easily, something that could stand in for a biological or chemical weapon. The material they settled upon was a compound called zinc cadmium sulfide. It was a fine powder, made up of particles small enough to drift on the wind and remain suspended in the air for long periods. It had a quality that made it especially attractive to the researchers. Under ultraviolet light, it glowed. The tiny particles fluoresced. shining with a faint light that allowed them to be seen and counted under the right conditions. This meant that after a release, investigators could move through the affected area, collect samples from the air and from surfaces, and examine them under special lamps to see how many particles had reached each location. By doing this across a wide area, they could build a detailed picture of how the cloud had spread. The glowing powder, in other words, was a tracer, a way of making the invisible visible, of tracking the path that a real weapon might take. The compound contained cadmium, and this is the detail that would later become the center of the controversy. Cadmium is a heavy metal, and heavy metals have a particular character that sets them apart from many other toxic substances. They do not break down, they do not decay into harmless components over time the way some chemicals do. Instead, they persist, and when they enter a living body, they tend to accumulate, gathering in the kidneys and the liver and the bones, building up slowly across years of exposure. The science of the early 1950s already understood that cadmium was dangerous. Workers in industries that handled the metal were known to suffer serious harm from breathing its dust or its fumes. There were documented cases of lung damage, of kidney disease, of a painful bone condition. The toxicity of cadmium was not a secret hidden from the experts. It was established knowledge, available to anyone with access to the medical and industrial literature of the day. Whether the particular compound used in the spraying zinc cadmium sulfide posed the same level of danger as pure cadmium was a more complicated question, and it would be argued about for many years afterward. The compound bound the cadmium together with zinc and sulfur, and some argued that in this form the metal was far less likely to be absorbed by the body. Others were not so sure. They pointed out that the particles were extremely fine, fine enough to be drawn deep into the lungs, and that no one had truly studied what happened when human beings breathed such particles in over days and weeks. The honest answer was that the people running the test did not know for certain how safe or unsafe the material was, because the studies that might have answered that question had never been done. They were releasing a cadmium compound over the heads of hundreds of thousands of people while remaining genuinely uncertain about its long-term effects. And here we arrive at the heart of what makes this story so disturbing. The researchers proceeded anyway. They did not wait for the safety studies. They did not seek the consent of the people who would be exposed. They did not even inform them. Instead, they organized their work around secrecy, around the careful concealment of what they were doing and why. If anyone asked about the equipment, about the trucks, about the fine haze in the air, they would be given a cover story. The official explanation, when one was offered at all, was that the military was testing methods of creating a smokescreen, a way of hiding cities from aerial observation in the event of war. It was a plausible enough story for the era, and it had the advantage of being partly true while concealing the real purpose entirely. The program that carried out these activities was part of a broader effort by the United States military to understand the science of biological and chemical dispersal. The work was managed by the Army Chemical Corps, and it drew on scientists and engineers who treated the project as a matter of national defense. In their minds, the logic was straightforward and even noble. The nation faced a genuine threat. An enemy might one day attack American cities with biological weapons, and to defend against such an attack, the military needed to understand how those weapons would behave. The ends, they believed, justified the means. The discomfort of exposing citizens without their knowledge was, in their calculation, outweighed by the importance of the knowledge gained. But there was another logic at work as well, one that the program's defenders rarely acknowledged openly, and it is here that the revisionist lens reveals something darker than simple wartime pragmatism. The neighborhoods chosen for the most intensive spraying were not random. In at least one of the cities, the tests were concentrated over a public housing complex, a place where the poorest residents lived, where families with little money and little political power were packed into government-built apartment blocks. These were people whose voices carried no weight in the halls of government, people who would not be believed if they complained, people who lacked the connections and the resources to demand answers. The choice to spray over such a community was not an accident of geography. It reflected a calculation, conscious or not, about whose bodies could be used and whose could not, about which lives were considered expendable in the pursuit of military knowledge. The two cities most associated with this story are St. Louis, Missouri, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, though the testing program extended far beyond them, touching dozens of locations across the United States and even reaching into Canada. But it is St. Louis that has come to stand at the center of the controversy because it was there that the spraying was most intense, most prolonged, and most clearly concentrated over a vulnerable population. St. Louis in the early 1950s was a city in transition, its industrial economy beginning the long decline that would hollow out so many American cities. It had its prosperous districts, but it also had vast areas of poverty, neighborhoods where black families and poor white families lived in crowded conditions, often in housing that was aging and inadequate. In response to this housing crisis, the city had embarked on an ambitious project. A massive public housing development was constructed, a complex of high-rise apartment buildings intended to provide modern sanitary homes for thousands of low-income residents. This development, with its rows of tall concrete towers, became one of the most prominent features of the city's landscape, and one of the most densely populated areas within it. Thousands of families lived there, the great majority of them poor, the great majority of them with no influence over the decisions that shaped their lives. And it was over and around this complex, among other locations, that the Army concentrated some of its most intensive spraying. The particles were released in such a way that they would drift across these densely packed buildings, settling on the structures and on the people who lived within them. The methods used to disperse the powder were varied and, in their way, ingenious. In some cases, sprayers were mounted on the rooftops of buildings, releasing the material into the air so that it could be carried by the wind across the surrounding area. In other cases, the equipment was mounted on vehicles, on trucks and cars that drove through the streets, releasing their payload as they went, a mobile cloud moving through the neighborhood. The goal in every case was the same, to put a measured quantity of the fluorescent particles into the air and then to track where they went. After each release, teams would fan out across the area, collecting samples and recording the concentration of particles at each point. From this data, they built their maps of dispersion, their detailed records of how the cloud had spread and where it had concentrated. For the residents below, the experience was strange and unexplained. Some remembered the haze in the air, a fine mist or fog that did not quite belong, that appeared and lingered and then faded. Some recalled the equipment, the unfamiliar trucks, the men working at tasks they did not understand. Children played in the parks and on the streets while the particles drifted around them. People went about their lives, breathing the air, never imagining that the air itself had been altered by their own government, that they were the subjects of an experiment they had never agreed to join. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. When questions were raised, the cover story was deployed. The military was testing a smokescreen, they were told, a defensive measure, nothing to worry about. And so the spraying continued year after year, the data accumulating in government files while the people who had generated that data remained entirely in the dark. The scale of the operation in St. Louis was considerable. The spraying did not happen once or twice. It was repeated many times across multiple years, building up a substantial record of releases over the same populated areas. This repetition is one of the reasons the St. Louis case became so significant, because it meant that residents were not exposed to a single passing cloud, but to a recurring presence, an exposure that accumulated over time in the same way that the cadmium itself accumulated in the body. Repeated exposures over months and years to a heavy metal that does not leave the body easily represent a serious kind of danger, the kind whose effects might not appear for decades and might be difficult ever to trace back to their source. For decades, none of this was known to the public. The program was classified, its records sealed away, its activities hidden behind the wall of secrecy that surrounded so much of the military's work during the Cold War. The men who had conducted the tests went on with their careers. The files gathered dust in archives, and the residents of St. Louis and Minneapolis and the other affected places lived their lives, grew older, raised families, and in many cases passed away, never knowing what had been done to the air they breathed. The secret might have remained buried indefinitely, were it not for the slow and persistent work of researchers and journalists, who, in later years, began to uncover fragments of the truth. As documents were declassified, it became clear that the spraying had occurred, that it had involved a cadmium compound, and that it had been concentrated over the poorest neighbourhoods of St. Louis. Many former residents, now older, began to wonder whether the powder that had drifted over their childhoods explained the cancers and strange ailments that had appeared in their families, and why no one had ever told them. When confronted with these revelations, the official response followed a pattern that has become familiar in the history of secret government programs. The authorities acknowledged that the spraying had taken place. They could hardly deny it, given the documentary evidence. But they insisted that the material used had been harmless, that the concentrations were too low to cause any health effects, that the cadmium in the compound had been bound in a form that posed no meaningful risk. The tests, they maintained, had been a legitimate and necessary part of national defence, conducted in good faith to protect the nation against the threat of biological attack. There had been no intent to harm anyone, they said, and no harm had in fact occurred. The smokescreen story gave way to a new official narrative, one that admitted the spraying but denied its danger. To address the lingering concerns, the government commissioned a scientific review. A panel of experts was asked to examine the evidence and determine whether the spraying could have caused harm to the exposed populations. The panel reached a conclusion that, on its surface, seemed reassuring. It found that the concentrations of zinc-cadmium sulfide to which residents had been exposed were, in its assessment, too low to have caused illness. On the basis of this review, the government maintained that the tests, however troubling in their secrecy, had not actually injured the people subjected to them. But this conclusion did not put the matter to rest, and for good reason. Critics pointed out that the review faced a fundamental difficulty that no amount of expertise could overcome. The data needed to assess the true health effects simply did not exist, and could not be reconstructed after the fact. No one had studied the residents at the time. No one had measured the cadmium in their bodies, tracked their health over the following decades, or compared their rates of illness to those of unexposed populations. The original purpose of the tests had been to study the dispersal of particles, not the health of the people exposed to them. And so when the time came to ask whether they had been harmed, the information that might have answered the question was missing, lost forever in the gap between what had been measured and what had not. There was a deeper problem with the reassurances as well. The official conclusion rested on the idea that the exposures had been low and that low exposures to cadmium were safe. But the science of heavy metal toxicity is not so simple. With substances that accumulate in the body and persist for years, the concept of a safe single exposure can be misleading. What matters is the total burden absorbed over a lifetime. A poor resident of an industrial city in the 1950s was already breathing air laden with pollutants, already exposed to lead and other contaminants from countless sources. The cadmium from the spraying did not arrive into a clean and healthy body. It arrived as one more insult among many, adding to a cumulative load that no one was tracking and no one fully understood. Independent researchers who later examined the question raised further doubts. Some argued that the methods used to estimate the historical exposures were too crude, relying on assumptions that could not be verified and may have understated the amounts involved. Some pointed to the particular vulnerability of children, whose smaller bodies and developing systems absorb and retain toxic metals differently than adults. The spraying had occurred over neighbourhoods full of children who played outdoors, who breathed deeply as they ran, who put their hands to their mouths after touching dusted surfaces. Whatever the average exposure across the whole population, the exposure of these children may have been considerably higher, and its effects, appearing perhaps as cancers many years later, would have been nearly impossible to distinguish from the ordinary background of disease. The truth in the end is that we do not know what the spraying did. We cannot know because the knowledge was never gathered. This uncertainty is not a comfort. It is itself a kind of harm, a permanent wound inflicted on the affected communities, who must live forever with the question of whether their illnesses, their losses, the early deaths in their families were the consequence of a secret decision made by men they never met. The government's inability to prove that harm occurred is not the same as proof that it did not. The St. Louis spraying was not an isolated event, and this is perhaps the most important context for understanding it. It belonged to a much larger pattern, a period during which government agencies conducted a wide range of experiments on unsuspecting citizens, often the most vulnerable citizens, in the name of science and national security. In hospitals, patients were exposed to radiation without their knowledge to study its effects on the body. In prisons, inmates were subjected to medical experiments. In one infamous case stretching across decades, poor black men were deliberately left untreated for a serious disease so that researchers could observe its natural progression even after an effective treatment had become available. These were not the actions of a few rogue individuals. They were institutional practices carried out by respected agencies, justified by appeals to the greater good, and concealed from the public for as long as concealment was possible. What unites these episodes is a particular way of seeing certain human beings, a way of regarding the poor, the powerless, the marginalized, as resources to be used rather than as people to be protected. The men who organized these programs did not, for the most part, think of themselves as villains. They thought of themselves as patriots and scientists serving a noble cause. But their cause allowed them to look at a public housing complex full of poor families and see not a community of human beings with rights and dignity, but a convenient test site, a population that would not object because it would never know. The bodies chosen to bear the risk were poor bodies. The neighborhoods chosen to absorb the exposure were poor neighborhoods. The calculation that some lives are worth less than others, that the poor can be experimented upon in ways the wealthy never would be, runs through this entire history like a dark thread. When the story of the St. Louis spraying finally reached the public, it arrived in a country that had grown more skeptical of its institutions. The years of secret experimentation had given way to an era of investigation and disclosure as old files were opened and old crimes were examined. For the residents of the affected neighborhoods, the revelations brought a bitter kind of vindication. The strange haze they half remembered from their childhoods had been real. The equipment they had glimpsed had been real. The unease they had felt, the sense that something inexplicable had happened in their streets, had been justified all along. But vindication is a cold thing when it comes too late, when the damage, whatever its extent, has already been done, and when the people responsible are beyond the reach of any accountability. Some of the affected residents and their descendants sought answers through the courts and through their elected representatives. They demanded investigations. They asked for their health to be studied, for the question of harm to be examined honestly and thoroughly. But for many in the community, the official reviews felt less like a search for truth than an exercise in reassurance, a way of closing the matter without truly confronting it. They had been told nothing when the spraying happened. Now, when they asked what had been done to them, they were told that it did not matter, that the amounts had been too small, that they should not worry. The pattern of being dismissed, of having their concerns waved away by experts and officials, repeated itself across the decades. The public housing complex at the center of the Saint-Domingue, Louis' story, did not survive. Within a few years of its construction, it had begun to fail, plagued by poverty and neglect and the wider collapse of the city's economy. The towers that had been built with such optimism became symbols of urban decay, and eventually they were demolished, reduced to rubble and dust. But buried within that larger story is the smaller, stranger truth that for a period of years those same towers had been the target of a secret military experiment, that the families living in them had been exposed to a toxic metal without their knowledge, and that when the buildings finally came down, they took with them whatever physical traces remained of what had been sprayed over them. What are we to make of all this, looking back from the present? The men who ran these tests believed they were acting in the national interest, and perhaps in their own minds they were. The threat they feared was genuine, but the means they chose crossed a line that should never be crossed in a society that claims to value the dignity and the rights of its citizens. They decided that some people could be used without their consent, that the poor and the powerless could be made into the unwitting subjects of dangerous experiments, that secrecy in the greater good could excuse the betrayal of the very public the military existed to protect. In doing so, they damaged the trust between a government and its people, a trust that, once broken in this way, is very difficult to restore. The deepest lesson of the St. Louis spraying may be this: the question of whether the powder caused measurable illness, important as it is not the only measure of the wrong that was done. The wrong was done the moment the decision was made to spray a toxic compound over a community of human beings while keeping them ignorant of it the moment those people were reduced from citizens to instruments, from neighbours to data points. A society that allows this, that permits its institutions to treat the vulnerable as expendable, has already suffered a profound injury, whatever the medical records may eventually show. The grey powder that drifted over those quiet streets in 1953 carried more than zinc and cadmium and sulphur. It carried a message about whose lives counted and whose did not, and that message lingered in the air long after the particles themselves had settled and faded. Today the story survives mostly as a footnote, a strange and disturbing episode recalled now and then when the subject of government secrecy arises. The records have been opened, the broad outlines are known, and yet the full truth, the human truth of what those exposures meant for the people who lived through them, remains forever out of reach. The families who breathed that air have grown old or passed on, carrying their unanswered questions with them. But the history remains, waiting to be remembered, a reminder that the gravest betrayals are sometimes the quietest ones, carried out not with violence but with silence, with the careful withholding of a truth that ordinary people had every right to know. They were never told. That, in the end, may be the part that should trouble us most of all.